Looks like it's working to me. I see the live on custom live streaming service on my end. I don't know if anybody else does.
Where do you see that? What is?
Up at the very top in the left-hand corner as I'm looking at my screen, it will say live on custom live streaming service.
I don't
Mine
see that, but
I have the same
middle of the
thing.
page.
I have the same message.
Okay,
okay.
so I think we might be good. What do you
Good.
think?
We're
Yeah.
good. I have you about that. It's working.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the tech people for getting us online. Good afternoon. My name is Tom Harnett, and I am currently the chair of the Right to Know Advisory Committee. And I want to welcome committee members and members of the public who might be watching to the first meeting of the Right to Know Advisory Committee for the year 2021. I am going to begin by having members introduce themselves. And because we have such a full house today, I am going to run through the list that I have been provided by Peggy. And I will begin with those members appointed by the governor. I'll call on you one at a time to introduce yourself. And the first being Linda Cohen. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Tom. I'm Linda Cohen. I am currently the town manager of Monmouth. I represent the municipal sector.
Thank you and welcome. Next, Kevin Martin.
Afternoon, I'm Kevin Martin. I am the FOA coordinator for the DEP. I'm here representing state government interests.
Thank you and welcome. And the next gubernatorial appointment is Eric Stout.
I'm Eric Stout, the member with background in information technology, but I feel like everybody else, it's more important to know technology going forward, not past technology. So I feel like I'm in the boat with everybody else.
Thank you. And the final gubernatorial appointment, Victoria Wallach.
Hi, I'm representing school boards and superintendents as part of the Right to Know laws and committee.
Thank you very much, Vicki. And now turning to appointments made by the President of the Senate, I'd like to introduce my Senate co-chair on the Judiciary Committee, Senator Ann Carney.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm excited to be a new member of this committee. And
Thank you.
I'm Ann Carney. I represent Senate District 29.
Thank you. And the next appointment by the President of the Senate, Amy Beveridge.
Hello, I'm Amy Beveridge. I'm the news director at Channel 8. I am serving on the Right to Know Advisory Committee representing broadcast interests.
Thank you very much. And I have not seen her, but is Linda Clancy in attendance?
She's going to be late and she'll be joining us by phone.
Okay, we can introduce her when she arrives. The next is the Honorable Justin Chanette, former legislator. Justin.
Thank you, Representative. Good to see you. I'm Justin Chanette. As you mentioned, I served in the House and the Senate. I was also a former journalist, but now I'm representing the public, and I'm very pleased to serve with you all in this capacity.
Thank you very much, and welcome aboard. Next, maybe one of the longest serving members that we have, but now in a new capacity, Chris Parr.
I'm Chris Parr. I represent law enforcement interests.
Thank you. Welcome back, Chris. And we do have one vacancy in Senate appointments, and that is the person representing a county or regional interest. We hope to have that position filled shortly. Turning lastly to appointments by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The first is myself. Again, my name is Tom Harnett. I'm a state representative for House District 83, which includes the town of Farmingdale and the city of Gardner. And I currently serve as the House Chair on Judiciary. The next person on my list is Taylor Asen. I am not sure if he was able to join us today. Taylor, are you on? I'll pass over Taylor. He is representing the public. Next is Suzanne Goucher, and I know that I saw her earlier today.
Yes, thank you. Suzanne Goucher, President and CEO, Maine Association of Broadcasters, representing broadcast interests.
Thank you very much. And next, Jim Campbell.
Hi,
I'm representing a, let's see, what is it? I can't read the right thing. Oh, advocates, statewide advocate organization of those interested in freedom of access.
Thank you and welcome back, Jim. Next, Judy Meyer.
Hi, I'm Judy Meyer. I'm the editor at the Sun Journal, the Kennebec Journal, and the Morning Sentinel, and I represent Maine's newspaper publishers.
And Judy, congratulations on your recent or upcoming induction into the Maine Hall of Fame of Broadcasting or Journalism. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
We then have the Attorney General or his designee, Jonathan Bolton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Bolton. I'm an Assistant Attorney General. I'm the FOA Coordinator for the Office of Attorney General, and I am representing the Attorney General.
Thank you. And last but not least, although she always tells me I call on her last when she testifies in judiciary, Julie Finn for the Chief Justice.
Yes, thank you, Representative Harnett. I'm Julie Finn, and I represent the judicial branch.
Thank you. And again, thank you all for being here today. I've had the honor of chairing this committee in the 129th legislature for 2 years, and it is a very dedicated and hardworking group of people that are committed to all of the policy ideals of the Freedom of Access Act in the state of Maine. And I thank you very much for volunteering your time to do this important work as we move forward in the 130th legislature. Just to get some housekeeping out of the way, the next item on the agenda is to elect a chair, and I would recognize Senator Ann Carney.
Thank you very much, Representative Harnett. I would like to nominate Representative Harnett to chair the Right to Know Advisory Committee. I know that he has served very effectively in that role in the past.
I'll second that.
Thank you. You have a motion and a second. Are there any other nominations? Darn. None. Peggy, do we need to recall or just a show of hands here?
If you're comfortable with a show of hands, that's, I think everybody else will be comfortable.
Okay, I certainly am, unless there's some objection.
I do think we need to use our physical hands because I believe the little icons don't show up on YouTube. So
okay,
procedural matter.
All those in favor of the nomination of Tom Harnett for chair, please raise your real hand.
Looks unanimous.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the ability to continue to serve in this role. As I said, it has been very enjoyable for me to do so. The next item on the agenda is the review and discussion of the 15th annual report of the Right to Know Advisory Committee, which we issued in January of this year, and the actions that were taken related to those recommendations. And I will turn for an overview. I should mention before I start, we are ably staffed by Peggy Reinsch, Colleen McCarthy-Reed, and Anna Broom, all from senior analysts from the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis. And as you will find as we go through this process, we could not do this work without their excellent efforts. So thank you all. And back to item number 3, Peggy will provide an overview of what happened in the last session, and I may amplify some of those descriptions, as might Senator Carney if she is so inclined. But Peggy.
Great, thank you. And I will mention, if you're looking for Anna Broom, she is not in this meeting. There are 3 of us staffing, so it's okay if one of us is actually taking a vacation and while you're meeting. So Colleen and I are here today. I don't know if you want me to share the screen of the page of your packet what we did was we took the page out of the report that you submitted back in January with each of the recommendations and then said what happened to it. So if it's helpful for me to share that screen, I can do that.
I think it might be helpful, not just for us, but for members of the public as
Okay, great.
well. Thank you.
Here we go. Come on, share. Okay, can you see this okay?
I can.
All right. So these are the recommendations from the 15th annual report. Hard to believe we've done 15 reports already. So your first recommendation last year was to enact legislation to cap copying fees. And so LD 1345, which became Public Law Chapter 313, did several of your recommendations, and this is one of them. Let's see, can I just switch to that? Can you see that? I switched. Great. So
Yes.
This is the copying fees change is, and I know this was not, or maybe it was a unanimous report from the Right to Know Committee. Anyway, a reasonable fee. So the agency, the copying fee, a reasonable fee is no more than 10 cents per page for a standard 8.5 inches by 11 inches black and white copy of a record. A per page copy fee may not be charged for records provided electronically. That doesn't mean that you can't charge a fee for records provided electronically. So that was the first recommendation. And now I'm going to go back. The second recommendation was to adjust the requirements for training, freedom of access training. And some of this was recommended by Brenda Kelty, who's also on the meeting, the Public Access Ombudsman. And that was also in LD 1345, Chapter 313. So we did a few things there. We clarified that the date that starts the clock running for when a public official needs to have that training is the date the person assumes office, basically, or assumes their duties. We clarified who is required to do the training. So not only the municipal officers and clerks, managers, or administrators, but also their deputies for those positions, as well as planning board members and code enforcement officers. We clarified what school officials are, superintendents, assistant superintendents, and school board members. And so that's the recommendations for training. The Judiciary Committee accepted that exactly as the Advisory Committee recommended. And the next one was enact legislation to improve the review of public records exceptions by including consideration of access to information that will assist in making informed decisions about health and safety. Again, that was LD 1345, and here's where those show up. Section 8 is what the Right to Know Advisory Committee needs to consider when reviewing existing public records exceptions. And Section 9 is what the Judiciary Committee needs to consider when reviewing proposed public records exceptions. So when another committee comes to the Judiciary Committee, this will be one of the many criteria the Judiciary Committee will look at in determining whether or not to recommend changes to the Committee of Jurisdiction. So please stop me if you have questions or just, jump right in there. And then the last recommendation that was contained in LD 1345 is to expand the Right to Know Advisory Committee membership to include a member with experience and expertise in data and personal privacy issues. And so that is back up here. It's this new paragraph O. We have been in touch with the governor's office, so they are aware about this, aware of this. This will take effect October 18th. So we're meeting without a vacancy in that slot right now. Next meeting, hopefully we'll have somebody on board already.
Thank you, Peggy. Before you go on, I believe that ends the discussion of all of the changes that were contained in LD 1345,
Yes,
is it?
yes.
Okay, so I want a natural break if these are enacted laws, obviously. But I wanted to know if there are any members of the committee that had any questions about those changes, or if the explanations were crystal clear as they typically are from Peggy. I'm not seeing hands or hearing voices, so Peggy, if you could go on, thank you.
Sure. So this one, I think, is a little bit of an oversight. Enact legislation to revise the membership of the Archives Advisory Board to include a public member and 2 members representing journalistic and news perspectives. The judiciary, these are kind of leftover recommendations from 2020, and the Judiciary Committee had recommended legislation in the 129th. It was referred to the State and Local Government Committee and got caught up in the truncated session. And I think the State and Local Government Committee was also kind of waiting for the new Archives Advisory Board to get put together. So this was not put forward in the 130th first regular or first special session. So there's really nothing to report on it. Although I will note that if you look down on your agenda later, Kate Mcbrian, the state archivist, is here and she promised me 2 minutes to update you of what's going on and some issues that she wants to share with you. So that might be one of the things you can talk about. And also Brenda Kelty and Eric Stout are both members of the new Archives Advisory Board. So you already have a connection with the Archives Advisory Board.
Thank you.
The next recommendation was based on a lot of things. One was that all our meetings last year were remote meetings, and we recognize that that is very useful. You also heard a lot from Maine Municipal Association last year about how municipalities were dealing with the shutdown and the restrictions on public meetings, and everybody agreed that remote meetings are a great way to stay connected and to keep government going, and that it's really important to support broadband statewide. And so that was one of your recommendations that you didn't actually attach to any legislation, but there was funding in the budget that passed, that the legislature passed and the governor signed, that supports that broadband expansion.
Thank you.
The next one was to amend certain provisions of law in Titles 8 through 12 relating to previously enacted public records exceptions. The Public Records Exception Subcommittee made 2 recommendations, and those were enacted. One was to make consistent the language about when the Attorney General is subpoenaing records. And I want to say this is, I don't remember which this is about. I don't think it might be the Unfair Trade Practices Act.
I think it might have been antitrust as well.
Is it antitrust or right? One of those. It's to make them all consistent, and so that they're confidential. But they may be disclosed by the Attorney General with the consent of the producing party, as well as in court pleadings and other papers filed in court. So that was to make it consistent across all the investigations that the Attorney General's office does. And then the other section, there were only 2, was about well drilling, that it was actually enacted just a few years ago to make information about private wells that are drilled confidential. The Maine Geological Survey, the Division of Geology in in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry said, nobody asked for this information. We see no reason to keep it confidential. And so they asked that you strike out that confidentiality provision. So one public records exception gone.
Thank you. And those are both in LD 1221, right? And
Yes.
that's in our packet as
Yes.
well. Thanks.
The next one is to enact legislation to amend the fees that may be charged by a public body to cover the actual cost of searching for, retrieving, and compiling a requested public record. This was not a unanimous recommendation of the Right to Know Advisory Committee. The Judiciary Committee talked about it for quite a bit and did end up enacting, I think it's exactly what the advisory committee recommended.
It was.
Yes,
It was.
including that an agency may retain any fees or costs charged under the section, which is interesting because some agencies were doing that already and other agencies were turning it over to the general fund. So this will make it consistent that the agency actually has authority to keep those fees, and the whole purpose of that is to cover their costs. And that is it for the recommendations that were contained in the report last year.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Are there any questions from committee members regarding anything that Peggy has explained to us? Seeing none, again, thank you very much, Peggy. And now we will turn to remote participation, which was a topic of great discussion on this committee in the 129th. And ultimately, there were multiple pieces of legislation that were proposed. LD 32 was enacted as Public Law Chapter 290. And Peggy, could you give us an overview of that? And then I may raise some issues for discussion as well.
Right. I think the main reason that there was a push to enact something is because there was something in the pandemic legislation that authorized everybody to, all the entities that were subject to the Freedom of Access Act, to conduct meetings remotely. And there were some requirements about what had to be done, and it was temporary. It expired 30 days after the governor's declaration of the emergency expired. And so I know I felt in the Judiciary Committee that they wanted to get something in place to replace that authorization once the emergency expired, because so many municipalities in particular, but other public bodies that are subject to the Freedom of Access Act were using remote participation. And so the basis of what was enacted in the emergency legislation by the legislature in the 129th had come from some earlier drafts that you had put together. And so we kept using that kind of basic idea about what is remote methods, and the Judiciary Committee sat down and said, okay, here are kind of the minimum requirements we think are necessary for an entity to continue with remote participation. And the first one was that the entity should be adopting a policy that says how they're going to conduct their meetings remotely, and limits that. And kind of the whole idea is the default is to have in-person meetings. But there are certainly circumstances when that's not going to be possible for the whole entity, but also for individual members. And so they tried to list out ideas of when it might be possible or it's appropriate for a member to be participating in the meeting, to be counted for the quorum, to be able to vote, and to do that all remotely. I can share that public law chapter if you want, if that helps.
I think that would be helpful because there's also a provision that allows meetings to go entirely remote in certain situations. And so in section 2B, 1 through 4.
Okay, so this is Public Law, Chapter 290, LD 32. It was an emergency because it needed to take effect pretty fast, and it created a new section 403B. And you should have all this in your pocket as well, in your packet. Might be in your pocket, but in your packet as well. So subsection 2 is about the requirements, and Representative Harnett was talking about what needs to be in the policy, and that's paragraph B. The whole policy is right. So the policy, the A requires a policy. B says, here are the circumstances in which physical presence for one or more members is not practical. Here, that it may include these. And I know that there are some entities that have adopted policies that have actually expanded what they have identified as circumstances in which it's not practicable for a member to be there in person. So the idea was to address emergencies when somebody's sick, or they have some other situation where they actually cannot travel in. If it's a membership of statewide locations, and somebody has to travel a long ways, that's a reason. And one of the things the Judiciary Committee has been hearing about over the past few years is all the island communities where it's really hard for people to travel from one part of the jurisdiction to another. And so that's what that paragraph 4 is looking at. And paragraph C says that when the members are attending by remote methods, that there has to be a method for the public to also participate in a remote way. And it doesn't have to mean an opportunity to attend by remote methods. It doesn't mean they have to participate, but they have to be able to see what's going on in the meeting if other members are attending by remote methods. I'm not explaining that very well. And the committee really focused on issues about making sure access was provided to individuals with disabilities. That's also in the very top part of this. If the entity is going to allow, or it's actually required to allow, public participation or input, then an effective means of communication between the members of the body and the public must be provided. And there are some situations, I think some school board meetings are required to have a public comment period, and there might be some other entities that are required to have a public comment period. Paragraph E is just kind of building on the required notice for meetings anyway. The public, when the public can attend by remote methods, then the notice has to explain how that happens, whether that is an email notice or something posted online or posted at the town office. It needs to explain how people can attend remotely. We talked about somebody participating, or a member participating remotely is present for purposes of a quorum and voting. Votes have to be, you have to make sure that they're clear, so the public knows. Excuse me. The public body must make all documents and other materials considered by the public body available electronically or otherwise to the public who attend by remote methods, to the same extent customarily available to members of the public who attend the proceedings of the public body in person, as long as additional costs are not incurred by the public body. That was something the committee spent a fair amount of time on. Didn't want to trip up selectmen or town councils by imposing significant costs, but still trying to make sure that those documents are available. And then it also says this, it does not authorize town meetings held pursuant to Title 30A, Section 2524. Those are the annual town meetings, or regional school unit budget meetings to be conducted using remote methods. So this section doesn't. If the governor imposes another emergency declaration, that would supersede this. And then this section does not apply to the legislature or a public body to which specific statutory provisions for remote participation apply. First of all, the legislature really has its own internal operating procedures, and it didn't seem right to try to dictate that by statute. And second, there are several entities now who already in statute have specific requirements for how they can meet remotely. Some of them are very specific, like the bond banks. And then there are some other that are not quite as specific, but they have been using that authority to meet remotely. And so this was not intended to supersede that authority. So that was a really quick overview.
That was a very thorough overview. Thank you very much, Peggy. And before opening it up for questions, if there are any, two things I want to point out, Peggy. One is we, the Right to Know Advisory Committee, have an obligation under Section 2A to adopt our own policy regarding remote participation. Is that accurate?
Probably. You are subject to the Freedom of Access Act. And so you probably do want to do that, in which case we probably should have taken that vote by roll call. But so you may want to do that. And I don't know if Mr. Bolton wants to comment on how the Attorney General's office has been advising boards and commissions that they represent on how to go forward with. I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No, not at all.
About how they go forward with adopting the policies. But yes, you may, it's probably a good idea for this committee of all committees to have a policy.
Sure, and the advice in terms of how to go about adopting the policy is basically, you want to provide notice, advance notice to the public, reasonable advance notice. You want to provide post a draft copy of the policy when attach it to the notice, and then the policy can be adopted by at a regular. You don't have to have a special meeting, but it has to be adopted at a meeting of the body. It can be a regular meeting, and I've generally advised that allowing public comment is a good idea on the proposed written policy before it's adopted.
Thank you, John. And can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
Because one of the issues that I've heard from municipalities is that they're being tripped up on is in paragraph 2E. And this was a part of a compromise that came out of the legislature this session, and that there was a strong sentiment among some that there had to be a physical location for members of the public to attend meetings in person. We heard that sometimes based on age or just lack of technological skill or history, that members of the public wanted to be able to go to their city council meeting or their select board meeting. So we have the sentence in paragraph 2E that says the notice must also identify a location for members of the public to attend in person.
Mm-hmm.
Does that apply to us as well?
Well, the only question in my mind about whether this would all apply is whether this advisory committee might be considered an arm of the legislature in some way, in which case you would be within that exemption at the end. I'm not sure, frankly, not sure what the answer to that question is, but assuming you are not the legislature, then yes, I would say that E would apply. And so there would need to be a location for physical attendance.
Right, and we'll talk about this later, but we're anticipating hybrid meetings moving forward so that we would have that. But just something for this committee to think about. I've heard from a number of municipalities that have struggled with the ability to provide the technology to do hybrid meetings, that they were able to do fully remote meetings and they can do meetings completely in person, but they have struggled with having some members attending remotely, members of the public attending remotely, and some attending physically at the location. So I don't have answers for that, but I think I'd certainly like to hear others' thoughts on that, but it might be something we need to look at moving forward.
The one caveat I'll give to what I just explained is that there is an exception to this physical location requirement if there's an emergency or urgent issue that the body is considering. And I know of at least one example where a body has decided that the ongoing COVID pandemic, even after the end of the official state of emergency, counts as an emergency for purposes of this provision.
And I'm aware of a couple of municipalities doing that, and I think there's a real difference of opinion out there as to what that sentence B1 actually means. Is it a full-blown declared emergency, or is it, as you said, an emergency that can be determined by the body itself? Okay. Well, Peggy, I'm just trying to, and thank you very much, John, for that outline and what you're advising other boards and commissions to do. What, Peggy, do you think we need to, I know you have some model policies. Is this something we could consider at an upcoming meeting?
Certainly. I mean, you can talk about whether you feel like you're an arm of the legislature. You probably, since the governor makes appointments as well, it might be better if you didn't, it might be better if you adopted a policy. I'm not sure you can say you're actually part of the legislature.
Well, it doesn't seem to me, I mean, the argument can be made, we're not the legislature,
right,
nor are we a public body to which specific statutory provisions for remote participation apply. So again, I'd be interested to hear from others, but my inclination would be to establish a policy.
Right, and I don't have any sample policies for you right now, but we could certainly maybe work with Mr. Bolton to put something together.
Are there other members of the committee that would like to be heard on this issue? And if you could use your blue hands, because that makes it easier for me to.
Which hand?
The raise hand function. I'm sorry, we don't all have a blue hand. The raise hand function under participants, it just shows a blue hand in your box. And Town of Monmouth, which is Linda, you have found your blue hand.
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to say, so once the remote policy, the ability to have this remote policy passed by the boards was allowed, our attorneys at Bernstein Shore came up with a policy that we adopted. So we had every board and committee in Monmouth, every board and committee adopt the policy first in person. And we're all meeting in person at this point. The select board went back to in-person meetings months ago because they just felt a disconnect with the community. But it's worked really well. So far, we haven't had to use the function where any of our members have been out, except for our building committee, where we have a teacher who's a part of that committee, and her children have been in and out of quarantine because of COVID in the schools. So she has had to participate a couple of times remotely. But we've made sure that when we did it, everything was done by a hand vote. It was a struggle to get everyone to pass it because I had to emphasize to everyone that you do not have to go to remote meetings. This just gives you the ability to do it. And if you don't adopt a policy, you're not going to be able to do it. But it's worked out really well for us. And, you know, from a municipal standpoint, I'm really grateful for the ability to be able to do it.
And can I ask Linda, when you had a member participating remotely, was conducting it in a hybrid fashion at the physical location a challenge?
Yeah, no, not a challenge at all. Sorry, I meant to elaborate a little bit on that too when you were talking about the difficulty of setting something up. So originally we were sitting in the basement of one of our buildings here in Monmouth, and we had a television set in front of us hooked to a laptop. I would hook up a Zoom meeting or set up a Zoom meeting that anyone publicly could log into, and we would see them, the select board would see them on the screen of the TV. And then they could hear us, we could hear them. We allowed public comment, and it worked very well. Very, very inexpensive to do that. We have since moved to a different location. I purchased a 70-inch screen so that, you know, because people in little boxes are a little hard for the select board to see from across the room. And we purchased a little bit more of an upgrade of equipment, speakers. It's not that expensive to get into it, and it works very well.
Thank you very, very much for that. Vicki?
Thanks. We too are crafting remote participation policies for our school boards to consider. But I had one question. It may just be me being dense. If one member of a committee is remote, does remote access have to be required? Does it only take one member to trigger the requirement that remote access has to be allowed for the public? Does that question make sense?
I think so. You're saying if there is one member who is
right,
present, does that then mean that all members of the public have the right to access the meeting remotely as well?
Correct.
If they choose. And I'm going to turn that over to John.
Sure. Yeah, that's been the interpretation of our office, that that if a single member of the body is participating remotely, that the body needs to make remote access available to the public.
And that was ours too, but I just wanted to double check. So thank you very much.
Are there other questions on remote participation? And Vicki, if you could put your hand down, that's another function. You could just says lower hand. Justin Chanette.
Thank you, Representative. I just had a question around, and it's sort of a question / statement, but you know, from the public standpoint, in terms of an accessibility point, it seems like, and I'm just going to speak first from areas around me, it actually increased public participation in a lot of government proceedings, that folks that normally can come out and drive to their town hall or whatever, or for whatever particular reason, maybe they have an ailment that they can't drive, whatever the particular reason is, we actually saw an increase in the amount of folks that actually went to town or city council meetings, which was actually a great thing to see, that increased participation. But it seems like with this law, we're still centering everything around emergency situations, where instead we have to entertain this idea of, if we don't have remote capability for the public, is it an accessibility problem for any sort of body where you're denying the public an ability to participate if they can't physically make the meeting? And so I want us to flip that on its head. Instead of thinking about it as from an emergency standpoint, why can't a town like, I'll use Monmouth as an example. Why can't Monmouth say that the public can participate remotely regardless of the membership? And so, and I'll let the town speak for itself, but I don't know if that's something that's been fleshed out by this committee, but I keep hearing this question more and more of, okay, if the membership of a particular body feels comfortable to meet in person, that doesn't negate the accessibility problem of the public to participate remotely. They still might need to participate remotely, and give them the option to do that is that covered under this law? And I think it seems like the answer to that might be no, depending on what is adopted at the local level, but getting that clarification might be useful.
Yeah, and before, thank you very much for that observation. And before turning it over to the people with their hands up, I can tell you that that was a big issue in front of the Judiciary Committee. It was also a big issue last year. If you look at the report that was issued in January of 2021, we heard from the Maine Municipal Association about a study they did of their membership, where many municipalities found greater participation when remote access was possible, and they welcomed that. This statute, I do not think, prevents that from happening if the municipality develops that type of policy, but I don't think it requires it. So that it might, as I said, this was a compromise piece of legislation, very much finalized at the end of the session, but I think the issues that you raised are issues that are very important for this committee to continue to discuss. And that's just my 2 cents, but I'm going to turn it over to folks in the order I saw the hands go up, starting with Linda Cohen.
Well, I just wanted to say, and I probably should have said this earlier, we really liked the participation that we were getting when we were totally using Zoom meetings. So the select board made a conscious decision to put that budget in for the voters' approval in June so that we could get that streaming equipment and continue to do this. So no matter whether the select board or any member of the select board is remote, our select board, our planning board meetings, our comprehensive plan meetings now are all set up for Zoom so that the public can participate. It's a great thing when you've got the public participating in the process. We don't hear a lot of public input, but at least they know that they can log in and be part of that process. And I heard from a lot of towns and cities during this, the whole thing, as we were talking about the remote policy, saying how much more their participation had increased and that they were going to make sure that there was a way for the public to participate remotely in the future.
Thank you, Linda. And I think that may partially address the concerns, Justin, that you raised. Eric.
Just wanted to add, as the IT member on the committee, that because of the pandemic, that crisis has led to a lot of opportunities, and it's become across the world really the new normal for business to conduct itself with remote meetings. And that's just kind of a struggle in the first few weeks and months, but pretty much people are, getting used to this, and why shouldn't it be the new normal even after the pandemic is over? I think the world of business has become the new normal.
Thank you. Chris Parr.
I have 2 questions. One relating to the, just for clarification, relating to the provision that pertains to access by individuals who have disabilities. Does that say reasonable accommodations may be provided or must be provided? I think it was subsection 2, paragraph C, maybe?
As I'm reading the language, it says the policy adopted pursuant to paragraph A must provide members of the public a meaningful opportunity to attend by remote methods when members of the body participate by remote methods, and reasonable accommodations may be provided. So it is, the word is may in the current legislation.
Thanks. The other question I had is with respect to the sort of non-applicability to the town meetings at the end. What was, I'm just curious, what was the rationale for that?
I recall, and maybe Senator Carney can correct me if she has a better memory, that there was just a strong defense of the town meeting process as being such a uniquely Maine and New England thing that was based on physical participation, that people wanted to keep it that way. Senator Carney has her hand up, so she may have a better recollection.
I actually had my hand up about the first point, but you're absolutely right. There was kind of a broad range of significance among committee members to physical presence and preferring a physical location for meetings and making meeting in person the default or standard option. And then regarding the accommodation, I think we did go back and forth between may and shall, and I think we landed on the word may because we didn't intend to create rights and enforcement mechanisms outside of the scope of the Maine Human Rights Act that would apply. And so we didn't want to layer anything on top of that. We really, anyone who is asserting a right to an accommodation would do that via the mechanism of the Human Rights Act.
Thank you for that. Are there additional questions or comments on remote participation? Seeing none, again, Peggy, thank you very much for the wonderful overview, and thanks for all of the questions and comments. And Peggy, unless there is a strong opposition from any member of the committee, I would ask that you and I try to work together on bringing a remote policy forward to the committee at a future meeting. Is that agreeable to those in attendance? Or if it's disagreeable, if you don't agree, if you could just indicate with your blue hand. And I'm not seeing any blue, so Peggy, is that something you and I can work on?
Absolutely, and I'm hoping that we can drag in Mr. Bolton, as well as we'll make sure Colleen and Anna are involved.
That would be very helpful. Is that something you could assist us with, John?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Thanks
very much. There are no other questions on LD 32 and its subsequent enactment. I will now turn to item number 5, which are new public records exceptions enacted and pending in 2021. Peggy.
Great. So as you know, the Judiciary Committee reviews proposed public records exceptions that are included in any kind of legislation coming out of the Judiciary Committee, but other committees as well. And we've developed a matrix that's based on the statute, and the committee goes through, Representative Harnett usually leads the committee through all of the questions to do the weighing about whether it makes sense for the new proposed public records exception to exist. It makes some record confidential or some specific information confidential, and sometimes it's usually new, sometimes it's an amendment. So in your packet is a list of all the reviews that the Judiciary Committee went through. It's 4 pages long. It's just a really short snippet of each one. All of them, the Judiciary Committee approved as written. The committees and the analysts that we work with have gotten to be pretty good at looking at what the statute is asking the Judiciary Committee to consider, and which means that the committees of jurisdiction are considering those things too. So there aren't as many issues that the Judiciary Committee is pointing out as there were in initial years. I'm happy to go over that chart individually. There was one bill that was vetoed. That was the Pine Tree Power Company bill. And there are 1 or 2 that are carried over on the Appropriations Committee table. So we will look at those again next year if they actually get enacted, funded and enacted. If you had a chance to look at that chart and you have any questions, then I am very happy to talk to you about any of them in particular.
And Peggy, we can make the matrix available to members of the committee if they want to see it, right?
Absolutely, and we're going to have to revise it to add the new consideration about whether the information would be helpful in making helping the public make a decision about health and safety.
Right. And we also have the vote tallies. Those are all roll call votes, I believe, right?
Yes, we have a great record of all the discussions on those. But I do think that most of them are pretty much either proprietary information, or they're the criminal history record information, or it's information that is already confidential under something else, and now that record is in the hands of somebody who didn't used to have access to that or didn't used to have custody of that record. Now that they have that record in their custody, that agency has a new public records exception, and that's why the Judiciary Committee looked at it.
Are there any questions for Peggy about any of the individual items on those 4 pages that were provided in your packet? And again, many of them allow for the release of aggregate information. It's simply trying to prevent the dissemination of personally identifiable information, business or personal, right? So are there any questions? Eric?
Yeah, it just seems to me, and we can talk about this in future meetings, but it seems to me that there may be some opportunity if there are general categories of things that could be a broad exception instead of having to have it carved out in one specific title and section for a particular agency or program, such as the aggregate or non-personalized, non-individualized data, summary data. Why couldn't that be across the board a broader exception? And once we have the data and personal privacy member on board, I'm hoping that in future meetings we can rediscuss whether there could be broad exceptions for what I would call no-brainers. If it's like personally identifiable information, why does each program and agency have to specifically have a statute to say, you can't have somebody's home email address or something like that just because it's collected by the government? So I think there's a couple categories of opportunities: aggregate data, non-personalized summaries, and things that are, to me, no-brainers of personally identifiable information that could be added as broad exceptions rather than adding a 367th exemption for one particular thing.
Thank you, Eric. And Peggy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would probably require some major statutory amendments, as the Judiciary Committee is required to do this under law, even though it's not binding on the Committee of Jurisdiction. Am I correct there?
Well, what I'm thinking, we already have in the main part, we have A through Y, I think it is. We have A, B, C, D, and M, for example, is an exception for IT infrastructure and cybersecurity topics. That's a broad exception, a major category. And then beyond those 20-some broad exemptions that are in the 403, I guess, then we have sprinkled throughout all the 30-some titles, these 300 plus that are cherry-picked as, very peculiar to that particular thing. But, what I'm suggesting is that the A through, those 20-some exemptions, maybe we can discuss in future meetings whether there could be another couple of broader exemptions rather than forcing everybody to carve out another title, whatever, section, something that really says something that may be common to, a lot of topics. That way they could invoke that broader exemption rather than having to carve out yet another 300 and some exemption. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, Thank you for that clarification, and maybe we can include that under item 10 when we get to discussion of issues and topics for this year. So thank you, Eric. Jim?
Yes, I wonder what are the italicized items on that list? What does that mean?
I think that means that they're not law yet. And so the Judiciary Committee looked at them, the ones that are italicized. For example, LD 1467 that came from the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. That bill was carried over on the Appropriations Committee table. So although it came out of ENR and it came out of the Judiciary Committee with approval, it hasn't been finally enacted by the legislature. Therefore, it's not law. But it could be law because it's still pending. LD 1708 was vetoed by the governor, so that's not really pending anymore. But the Judiciary Committee did look at that language and said, go ahead with that. That was kind of a hurried thing at the end of the session, but that's in italics because the committee looked at it, but it's not law, and it won't be law because it was vetoed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Peggy. Any other questions on item 5 on the agenda about new public records exceptions enacted and pending? Seeing none. Jim, is your hand still up? Or if not, if you could just hit the lower hand feature. I can't control it from here. Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Peggy, for running through those. When folks may have more time to review the chart that you have, if there are any statutes that you have questions about, we can bring them up at subsequent meetings. Turning to item number 6, a review of existing public records exceptions. And I believe I am going to turn both items A and B over to Colleen.
Sure, thanks. And this item relates to the Right to Know Advisory Committee's ongoing responsibility to review existing public records exceptions in the statute. And for those who have served on the committee before, you're familiar with this 2-year cycle that's set up in the statute for the advisory committee to review existing exceptions in a certain number of titles in the statutes. And we provided a chart that's in your packet that lists the public records exceptions that the advisory committee should look at this year as you move forward. And it includes a number of exceptions that were, I don't know why there's feedback, so I apologize for that. A number of exceptions from last year that the Public Records Exception Subcommittee initially looked at in titles 8 to 12. And there were 26 exceptions, primarily in Title 8, and then a handful of exceptions in Title 12 that the Public Records Exception Subcommittee tabled for further discussion. So those are included and are on the schedule to be reviewed and looked at this time. And then in titles 13 to 21A, we've identified 74 exceptions among those titles for the advisory committee to review. And we expect that that will be done as in the past by the appointment of a public records exception subcommittee that would look at things initially and then make further recommendations to the full advisory committee. As part of our process that we have done over the years, we have reached out to each agency, or have identified sort of the primary agency and or stakeholders that are responsible for administering these exceptions. We've sent questionnaires to all of them, and that's sort of been the jumping off point for the Public Records Exception Subcommittee to begin the review of those exceptions. So We have most, if not all of those questionnaires back from the agencies. So we expect that if you want to follow along with that process and you reconstitute a public records exception subcommittee this fall, that we can get to work with them in very short order and sort of reviewing each of these exceptions. I'm happy to share the chart if that would be helpful, but it really just is a snapshot of each of the exceptions, where they're located statutorily, and then really just a brief description of the type of information or the category of information that has been made confidential. And I think, as you noted, with the Judiciary's committee review of proposed public records exceptions for it contained in new legislation in the first regular session, you can identify sort of broad categories in these titles of information that's protected as confidential, as either proprietary information, personally identifiable information. And that's really a theme as you look at, I think, as we'll go through this, and these existing exceptions in these titles, they really fall into those broad categories.
Thank you, Colleen. And I note that, and I want to thank the members of the Public Records Exceptions Subcommittee from the last session, the 129th. We had Linda Clancy, Julie Finn, Eric Stout, Chris Parr, who was eventually replaced by Kevin Martin, but we're fortunate to have him back as well. So we have a strong bench of people who have done this work in the past, and I'm hoping they will continue to have their interest in that, because I think we have no choice but to form a subcommittee on this. And my only question, Colleen, is I know we fell behind a little bit for a variety of COVID-related reasons. Given your vast experience on these types of reviews, are you pretty confident we can catch up to get back on schedule with the list that you've put in front of us?
I think so. I think, there's 26, as I mentioned, from sort of last year's review. I think there were 14 that related generally in Title VIII to the Department of Public Safety and the Gambling Control Board. I think those can be reviewed. The other 12 relate to the Department of Marine Resources. So I think that part can be caught up with very quickly. And then I think the new of the 74, based on our prior reviews, I think the Public Records Exceptions Subcommittee should be able to get through those and get us back on track in terms of your timeline.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Are there any questions regarding Colleen's presentation or the work of the Public Records Exceptions Subcommittee? Peggy?
I just want to point out that, and Colleen and I have talked about this, and we decided that it's probably best to hold off, because the Judiciary Committee did a pretty comprehensive bill about records relating to juveniles and the juvenile justice system, both records held by the courts and records held by law enforcement or prosecutors. And those are all new. They're all effective. They're either effective in October, or they might not even be effective until January 1st. I'm trying to remember the effective date of that. So items 11 through 17 are in italics. We did not send out questionnaires for those because they're new, and there wouldn't be any way to respond to kind of what the experience is for those public records exceptions. Plus, the Judiciary Committee did just go through all those this year, and I identified them as a appropriate balance there with regard to the interests of juveniles compared to the public's interest in having access to that information.
And we did that when we applied our matrix that you just described in the prior agenda item, correct?
So, maybe you can back off the 74 by about 7.
Okay, thank you.
There are also a handful that have already been repealed since the last review as well. So there are, I think, 3 or 4 of those that will no longer be subject to review by the subcommittee as well.
Thank you very much. Are there questions or comments regarding public records exceptions? Seeing none. I think I'm seeing none. Yep. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Peggy. The next item on the agenda is we welcome Brenda Kelty, who has been supporting us for so many years as the Public Access Ombudsman, and she's going to give us an informal update about her work in the Office of the Attorney General in her role as Ombudsman.
Thank you.
Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you, Representative Harnett and Senator Carney. I don't see you there. And members of the committee, hello to everyone. Nice to see you all again. I think I know everyone, except I don't remember meeting Justin Chanette. So I just want to send out a special hello to Justin. If we haven't met, it's nice to see you. My name's Brenda Kelty. I'm the Public Access Ombudsman for the state of Maine. And in that role, I handle a variety of tasks related to the Freedom of Access Act, education and training. I answer inquiries from the public. I'm a direct line, and I resolve conflicts related to FOA disputes, and also look for ways to improve the law or the implementation of the law and make recommendations. And I have a couple of things to bring to you today in that part of my role. So I have a little bit of like a grab bag of things I just wanted to talk about briefly. In terms of how has the work been since we last met, it's been very busy. And I think that added on to the general questions about FOA, we now have this new layer of remote proceedings and how that works. And even though I think the statute is very well written, although I have a recommendation for another amendment, yikes, I think that it's just a matter of rolling it out and getting the kinks out and trying to figure out how best to make that work. So we're still in that stage, I think, of rollout. And I think we are going to see a few bumps in the road on the way out. But in general, I think there's been pretty broad acceptance of this mechanism, and it's worked fairly well. So, but I do get a lot of questions about remote proceedings now, as well as everything else. I would also say, generally the tenor, the atmosphere out there, there's, a lot of adversarial sort of contexts where FOA comes into play. And so it's sort of natural that there are a lot of disputes around FOA. And I do see, what I would say is continues the trend of increasing use of FOA and increasing disputes around responses to FOA requests and whatnot. So I don't see that abating in any way. I don't have my up to the moment numbers for you. I can get those at some point if you're interested. I do an annual report on my contacts, and I also do an annual report on the executive branch state agency FOA activity, but I don't have that for you today. So I did have a couple of things I wanted to bring to you. I had 2 contacts that brought issues that seemed like they might be something that the Right to Know Advisory Committee might want to address. And so in speaking with those people, I promised to bring that forward. So the first one is a topic that we've talked about in the past. It's come up several times, and I don't know if the committee wants to revive it, but it has to do with the waiver of fees. And I think we had, last time we discussed this, and Peggy may remember, set it aside and just tabled it, didn't really move forward with that. But I've had it come up again, and I think we still have complicated issues in terms of how that would be applied. But I personally think that we should not stop thinking about how the fees affect accessibility for people, and whether or not the way our fee waiver provision is written just sort of in a implicit way promotes no fee waivers. Just, I would like to address that question a little bit more deeply, but I'm not taking a position that we shouldn't have a fee waiver. I just feel like we've looked at it a little bit in the past. It's come up again in a major way. So if the committee wants to move forward with a fee waiver discussion, I'd be happy to provide more information about why this question's coming up for me again. If you don't want to move forward with it, that's fine. And then the second question is a brand new one. I've never seen this. Eric might know something about this, but I have never heard of it. And this is a question about emails and accessibility to emails that are being created and maintained on what are called list management tools, marketing platforms. And an example of that is something called MailChimp. I don't know if anybody's familiar with MailChimp, but essentially what MailChimp can do for you, it's a marketing platform, but it can create lists, segmented audiences, and it can send targeted emails to those lists. Now, that normally wouldn't be a problem, but what I'm hearing is that this kind of platform, and MailChimp isn't the only one, is becoming more common with candidates for elected office, and that they are then continuing to use MailChimp as elected officials, but they're using their .gov address. And this is what I've been hearing. And that is starting to have this question about whether those are government emails or whether those are campaign emails. And then once they're on this different platform, if there's full accessibility to those emails, what I've heard is that you can get the text of the email, but not the recipient's name. So that metadata is not there. And so I have not done a full research on this, and I'm only presenting this as a possible area of technology that may be something we want to make sure we're on top of. And like I said, I just got this question, so I haven't even had a chance to take a look at it. I don't know exactly how prevalent it is, but if it is if there are government business emails there that should be accessible, then we generally say that we should also have the metadata for records. And if that isn't available, then I would start to have some questions about that. So two things, just whether the fee waiver might be something you want to put on your list, and these list management tools such as MailChimp, if we might want to look at whether or not those are raising questions for us in terms of public access. No, I do have a third thing, and this would be an amendment to the remote proceedings statute. And if you want me to wait, I can chime in when you're discussing this under number 10, or I can add that now, Representative Harnett. I don't know if you want me to say more.
You can do it now, and then we can come back to it, but you might as well put it out on the table. Thank you.
Okay, let's put it on the table. One thing I thought when I started to think about the policies that the agencies have to write, it didn't even strike me until after the emergency legislation had expired in the summer. Now, under the emergency legislation, everybody was meeting remotely, and there was a huge push at that time for agencies or boards and committees or anybody who was going to be subject to FOA to go ahead and get their policy in place because everyone was meeting remotely under the emergency legislation. Then the emergency legislation expired. And after that point, if you didn't have a policy, you could not meet remotely. You'd have to, and this is my read of the statute, you'd have to meet in person, enact a policy, and then you could meet remotely. And I didn't, like I said, I was not really clear on that until that started to happen. And because I provide advice to the Maine Civil Legal Services Fund Commission, which only meets biannually, and they had an October meeting, and they asked me if they had to meet in person to enact a policy because they did not have a policy in place. And their concern coming into October was the prevalence of the Delta variant. And they had, really felt like there was enough there to declare an urgent issue or a limited emergency related to pandemic reasons. And so I advised them that they had to meet in person, enact the policy, and then they could have their biannual meeting remotely, which is what we did. And they had their meeting this week. My suggestion would be that the statute be amended looking into the future, that if there is an urgent issue or emergency situation, that the body does not have to meet in public to declare that they could have a remote meeting. And if they were, had a yes vote that there was a situation, that they could then enact their policy, because there will be future boards and commissions that are created from this point forward that they're not going to be created with a policy. They're going to have to meet in person, right, to enact a policy. And I'm just concerned that we weren't thinking that there would continue to be in the future emergency situations that would warrant a fully remote meeting. So I'm just concerned that we didn't account for that possibility. And now we have, boards and commissions that have to meet in person, and essentially they have to meet in person to declare that they shouldn't be meeting in person. And so there's something not quite, I just feel like we haven't quite solved that problem. So my suggestion would be to discuss whether or not you think that is something that needs to be addressed, and then how to go about writing something to cover that situation. I have to say, and I have to put this out on the table, but I don't believe that this body should be meeting remotely without policy in place. And that was a mistake that we may be able to correct, but I am concerned. The other problem is I don't know how you're going to meet in person. You're certainly not going to do it in judiciary because you can't socially distance in there. You're too many people. So you have a serious, when I had the Maine Civil Legal Services Fund Commission, there's only 3 of them. So it was fully, socially distanced and all the protocols in place. But I don't think it would be right for me to not speak to this point. I do think you need to meet in person if you do not have the policy in place. And I think that's pretty much it on my list. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brenda. And thank you for bringing up that issue, because we are the Right to Know Advisory Committee. We should be complying with the Right to Know laws, the Freedom of Access laws. And we hope to meet in hybrid fashion in the Appropriations Committee room, which is larger and does allow for social distancing. But are you saying for us to adopt a remote policy in strict adherence with the new remote participation law, that everyone needs to be there physically to accomplish that? Or can
that's what I'm advising to people who ask me that question. Certainly you only need a quorum.
Okay.
But I think the way the statute is written, there's no provision for meeting remotely until you have that policy in place.
Okay. Thank you. Obviously an issue that we need to resolve. Thank you. Are there questions for Brenda regarding that issue or any of the other issues that she has raised? And just one more, Brenda, I'm sorry. When you were talking about the waiver of fees, I'm assuming you're talking about both the copying charges and the hourly rates. Is that?
And the fee waiver provision is not specific to what charges, and it allows a partial fee waiver. So the way it's written now, it could apply to any of those, either labor or actual cost fees. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And I know that that was an issue that Judy Meyer raised when we were discussing the bill about the hourly rates and, expanding the amount of free time, but raising the hourly rate after the first 2 hours. So, but I know there's interest, at least on some committee members, on that topic. Justin.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a question for Brenda or if we need to wait for another time to bring this up, but just to kind of piggyback off of that comment regarding sort of abiding by the remote law as a committee. Is it because we sort of, as a committee, sort of felt like we were an extension of the legislature, that we had been meeting remotely and as such haven't adopted a policy up until this point? I'm just trying to understand that piece of like how we got to this place of not having a policy written down for this committee. And it seems like it could have been because we sort of viewed ourselves as an extension of state government versus a separate entity. But I'm just sort of curious about that as we go into creating a remote policy so that everyone feels comfortable.
Thank you for the question. Correct me if I'm wrong, Peggy, but I think we were meeting remotely in adherence with the governor's emergency declaration. Whether in retrospect we should have been thinking about adopting a policy, then well, we did not, but I don't think we were operating outside of the law when we met remotely last in 2020.
I think you're correct that you were able to do that last year under the law that had passed. And in getting started this year, Colleen and I work with some other committees who have the option of meeting remotely, because the joint rules that authorize legislative committees to meet remotely were extended to apply to everything in the interim. And so we weren't really focusing on whether or not we had to have a policy in place. We were looking at how the other committees were shifting to completely remote meetings because of the Delta variant. And that's kind of what we were focusing on in coming up with dates and doing the first meeting before we actually have a policy in place. So, I mean, I feel guilty that as an attorney, I didn't advise you otherwise. I was thinking about how the legislature works and not so much as this as a separate entity.
Thank you. And you don't have to feel guilt about it. You've got a bunch of lawyers here. And thank you, Justin. Maybe that's not a full answer to your question, but it's certainly a question that we need to answer moving forward. Other questions regarding Brenda's report? I'm just going to scroll. Thank you very much, Brenda. Oops, Eric.
Yeah, so does this mean that this will be on the agenda for a future meeting to really drill into those three topics, fee waivers and accessibility of kind of off-system records, and then remote proceedings? Is that going to be on the agenda for a future meeting? Is that the idea?
I think we're going to have to consider and start that discussion today when we talk about issues that we want to focus upon, realizing that our time is limited as to the number of issues we can take, and it might require some sort of polling about what the committee thinks are the most important issues before us. But with respect to the third one about remote participation in a policy, that will definitely be on an agenda for a future meeting, probably the next meeting. Does that answer your question, Eric? Thank you. Anybody else on this topic? Seeing none, again, thank you very much, Brenda, for your report and giving us all sorts of things to think about moving forward. We appreciate that. Next on the agenda is pleased to welcome Kate Mcbrian, the new Maine State Archivist, who wanted to introduce herself and give us a report about the work that's being done over there. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Representative Harnett, and thank you all committee members for having me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity. I just wanted to pop in and say hi, let you know who I am and some of the good work of the State Archives right now. As you said, my name is Kate Mcbrian. I'm from Union, and I'm the state's 4th state archivist. I'm also very humbled to be the first woman to hold the office, so I appreciate that opportunity. For those of you who aren't super familiar with the state archives, we really serve 2 roles for state government. We collect the state records that are historically significant and should be preserved for future generations to research and to learn about the work, the awesome work that you're all doing. But we also help to manage the records management program for state government. So we work with agencies to set their record schedules, determining what records should be archival, what records do not need to be kept forever, but how long those records should be kept before they are destroyed, what's an appropriate time. And so because of that, I really firmly believe that the state archives is essential to a transparent state government, that we are working with agencies to determine how long these records are kept. And by doing so, we're really ensuring transparency and accountability of each of these agencies as well. So with that in mind, I really hope to work very closely with all of you to ensure that the appropriate state records are open and they're easily accessible. For the historical records aspect of that, we're already hard at work trying to make more things accessible than have ever been open before. Just this spring, we actually put online our very first catalog of all of our holdings. We finally have a full inventory of every box that we hold of archival records. These are the records that are going to be kept forever. It's kind of like your card catalog in the library. It's just the title of the box. It doesn't tell you everything that's inside the box, but it's a really good start. And it gives us a good idea of what we have, and it allows people access from their home to see what we have and what we are maintaining for them to access. And you can find all of that on our website. We are also very actively digitally imaging a bunch of our records and regularly putting them up onto the Digital Maine website. For example, we've recently imaged a lot of the trademarks that were registered with the Secretary of State's office. Those are online. We've been adding Civil War correspondence. That's always a big thing for researchers. And we actually just this year finished a federal grant project where we digitally imaged the early journals for the state legislature. We transcribed them all, we put them online so people can read through the record of your predecessors. Starting from 1820, we have all the way up to 1844 online and accessible, and we're going to keep going until I think it was 1863 when those journals started to be published regularly. So we're really opening up the early history of state legislature. With that though, I think the part that has me the most excited is that just within the past year, we've been looking at our statute and really beginning to apply the 75-year requirement that records that are transferred to the archives and are in the archives holdings are only confidential for a period of 75 years before they can be made open and accessible. We've never really applied that rule before, and we're slowly beginning to, with the help of the Attorney General's office, with their guidance and some of their input. But we are very slowly beginning to open up the records of the Augusta Mental Health Institute, some of the patient records. We have those dating back from 1840. And these are things that researchers and genealogists have been trying to request for years, and we've never been able to share before. We've been doing that with Pineland records as well. And I'm actually applying for a federal grant to digitize and put online the records of the Department of Indian Affairs, though that collection was completely closed and confidential until just recently. So we're beginning to try to open up a bit more of our history and more of the state government's work so that it's accessible to people. But I do want to assure you too, we're trying to be super careful with tons of oversight. Several of us have to look at each individual record and sign off on it and approve it before we actually share it with the person who's requested it. So we're trying to make sure that everything really does meet the criteria. Any other federal laws that may apply, like HIPAA, that kind of thing. We're trying to be very careful with it. So it's a slow process, but it's definitely opening up more records. And we have a lot of researchers and genealogists who are super excited about this. So with that in mind, I do have one thing that I'd love to ask for you to consider in the coming year. One of the things is that the records that are exempted from public record laws, that are made confidential, I would love to see some consideration for the historical and permanent record impact of that. My feeling is, as a historian, there's lots of records that should be made confidential right now because they hold personally identifiable information, and we need to protect those individuals. But 100 years from now, 150 years from now, do those records still need to be confidential? And would they be important for future researchers to access, to learn about your work, to understand our history? And so I would love to see that part of the consideration as you're looking at what records should be confidential, which ones shouldn't. So that's something I'd be really happy to talk with you more about and provide any guidance or any input that I could. So that's what I have. I want to keep it short for you. I know you have a lot of work, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kate. Congratulations on your appointment and the significance of being the first woman to hold the position. And thank you for being here today. Are there questions from committee members for Kate about her presentation or anything to do with the archivist position? Eric.
Yeah, hi, Kate. I'm honored to be Brenda and I are honored to be a member of the Archives Advisory Board, so it's a good crosswalk for us. But when I was studying the materials in advance of this meeting, the thought occurred to me that not all confidential records are made equal, and I'm glad to hear you say that there's lots of oversight and you get individual review. Which is good, but I guess my suggestion would be, maybe there's, big buckets, broader categories to say, instead of looking at every record individually, maybe you do that, but the guidance or the framework might be, you have 5 or 10 categories of things, of confidentiality, and then this category is treated this way and this category is treated that way. That might achieve your outcome with a little more discipline and structure and more efficiently, maybe. Just a suggestion.
Definitely, and that's a great suggestion, Eric. One of the things we're doing, we are trying to apply sort of a general bucket rule to certain types of records. But one of the things we're doing too is, like, could we say that patient records from AmHi, anything that dates to before 1900, we can feel it's pretty safe that it's going to be very safe to share that people have died a long, long time ago. Their records were closed more than 75 years ago, that it's going to be pretty safe. And so we're trying to look at that. We want to be careful. We want to ease into it. But that's a kind of bucket thing we're looking at. Can we apply a big umbrella to some of this?
Thank you. Are there, I'm sorry, isn't a little bit, Jim. Jim, you're muted.
Hi there. First of all, I was going to say something similar to what Eric had to say, but I was also wondering, in terms of the amount of time that it makes sense to keep records confidential or whatever they're going to be. Do you have some sort of yardstick in mind for that as you think that we should be thinking about this?
I do, and it varies based on the state. Right now in our statute, it says any records that come to the state archives after 75 years, they are no longer confidential. So once that record has been closed for 75 years, it can be open freely. I think for the most part, that's good. What I would ask is that if there's very specific confidentiality that you all would recommend applying to a set of records, if you think 75 years isn't enough, if you feel like that should be more, that could be written into the legislation. Something to think about. You know, there's adoption records right now are kept for 100 years. They're not openly available, but they're supposed to be destroyed after 100 years. I would ask, is that appropriate? Should we maybe make them open after 150 years for genealogist purposes? Something, those are the types of things that would be helpful to talk about and consider.
And what about the possibility of less than 75 years?
Definitely. It used to be 50 years, and it recently got changed to 75. I find most states tend to do somewhere between 75 to 100 years, trying to look at someone's lifespan and a little bit of time afterwards. But certainly, I think that could be part of the conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you. Eric, is your hand up for a second time?
Yeah, yes, if you would. So I was thinking the same thing, you know, along the idea of like broad categories of records. If the assumption is that the confidentiality is driven by the lifetime of the person, you know, like the census records, you know, are available, I don't know if it's 80 years after the, you know, something like that. So that guy, but are there categories of confidentiality that aren't about an individual person and their lifetime? And so maybe those categories, those broad buckets could be a lesser time and then would be more available if it's not really about the lifetime of the person, you know, a different category of confidentiality.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Additional questions or comments? Checking all. Again, seeing none, thank you very much, Kate. We look forward to working with you in the future. The next item on the agenda is a discussion regarding a very thorough memo that we received regarding standardized language for exceptions to the public records definition, how they should be, what sort of templates we might need, what possible areas of confusion and ambiguity there are right now. So I'm not sure who to turn this over to, Peggy. Is it you or Colleen?
It's me.
It is Colleen. Okay.
It is me. As Representative Harnett mentioned, we did share with you a report. I'm happy to share a copy of it if it would be helpful to put it up on the screen, but just to give you a little background on it. This is a report that came out of an initial recommendation of the Public Records Exception Subcommittee as part of its work in 2019, and it was a recommendation in the 2020 report in January of 2020. So, but it directed the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis, the staff to consult with the Revisor's Office and the Right to Know Advisory Committee in an examination of the existing statutes for inconsistencies in the wording of public records exceptions, and with an eye towards recommending standardized language for use in drafting statutes to clearly identify what information is confidential and what circumstances under which that information may appropriately be released. And some of the questions that, Ms. Mcbrian just raised about, the length of time for records, those are some of the things and some of the potential inconsistencies that you might see in the statutes. And so the memo that we laid out for you just sort of goes through how public records exceptions are designated as confidential in the statute, and the definition of public record does include a category of or does exempt from the definition of a public record those provisions of law where records have been designated as confidential. And then I think, as Mr. Stout mentioned earlier, there are other paragraphs in that definition of public record that identify other categories of information that are not considered a public record. But sort of over time, because of that paragraph A, I think the statute or the convention has been to identify things as specifically confidential records or information in other areas or other titles of the statute. And that's part of what the advisory committee has been charged to do in its duty to review existing public records exceptions. So what we did is sort of we have identified as part of the work with the Public Records Exception Subcommittee, there's been a recognition that there's some inconsistency among all those exceptions in the statute as to sort of the language that those exceptions use to designate something as confidential, whether they call it confidential, whether they say something's not a public record, whether they say a record is confidential and not a public record. You know, there's lots of inconsistencies in the language. And so the exception subcommittee, I think originally in tasking us with this work, wanted the advisory committee to take another look at maybe making some stronger recommendations for consistency and standardization in the language as more and more exceptions are added to the statute or as part of your review of the existing exceptions. And so as we laid out in the memo, sort of some of the questions that the advisory committee might want to ask, and sort of identified some of the ambiguities, and then also provided some various examples in the statute for different types of situations in drafting that relate to the confidentiality of a record, and then go through and provide some options and make some recommendations for standardized language. So this is the initial report back to the advisory committee. We stand ready to help you as the staff to sort of take a look and sort of at this memo more in depth and make some decisions for recommendations in the future. It may make sense as you talk about next steps that the Public Records Exception Subcommittee, should it be reconstituted, in looking at some of the existing exceptions that I just talked about, sort of in titles 8 to 12 and 13 to 21A, that the exception subcommittee also take a look at this memo more in detail and make have some more discussion and make some potential recommendations back to the full committee for your consideration. I don't know if anybody has any questions about the memo. Peggy and I are happy to answer any questions and talk about maybe some of the different categories, but one of the duties of the advisory committee is the potential to make recommendations related to standardized language. And I think the exception subcommittee, sort of as they've done their work, has noticed sort of different nuances and inconsistencies in the statutory language and thought it might be useful, I think, for the full committee to consider developing recommendations for standardized language that then could be used by us and other legislative staff in drafting as we move forward. I'll stop there, but as I said, I'm happy to share the memo, or we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Colleen. Are there questions? And thank you for the memo. It really is quite detailed, raising lots of questions about the best way to move forward. Eric.
Yeah, so as I studied that the other night, it is really quite excellent, and I really like the idea of specific examples and then standardized language to apply. But it got me thinking, if there's a common theme over and over and over of the same kind of broad category of exemptions, we're still working from a bottom up, 300, almost 400 specific exemptions. There may be some that are so common that could they be added to the list of A, B, C, D, and then have a X, Y, and Z added. And then everybody wouldn't have to apply the same language over and over and over for their little particular niche of a thing. They could just refer back to the broader list, so that, for 6 years, you've heard me kind of harping on this theme of having, broader exemptions for PII in particular. But then there's other broad categories. Why have to do it bottom up, that everybody has to have yet another statutory exemption if it's such a common theme? So I want to just bring that back up again. So thanks for tolerating me.
Thank you, Eric. Brenda.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to speak again. I wanted to say, I did not mean to put that crying face up there. Okay, make it go away. I don't know, how do you make it go down anyway? Can you see that emoji? Okay. I'm not crying, but I do think that there is some urgency to addressing this, because the way I've seen it play out in the, by the way, this is really excellent and so helpful. And there is ambiguity when the language says is not a public record. And the way that I've seen that play out is the possibility that an agency interprets that as they don't have to deny anything because it's not a public record. So it's not being denied. It simply isn't, it is not a public record. And so you may get a response that says no responsive records. But if the agency interpreted that language to mean that the record is not a public record, they don't think they have to deny anything. So the requester is not getting an actual denial and is not being put on notice that the agency has deemed something not a public record, which to me frustrates the purpose of having the appeal provision in this statute, or even the denial requirement. Because if you can just call it not a public record and not have to deny, then the remedy is gone and the purpose of the statute has been frustrated. So I do think that's ambiguous. I would love to see that language changed so it does not say is not a public record. It's either it's confidential, and that's the language that would be used. I strongly support addressing this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Additional questions or comments regarding the memo? Seeing none, again, thank you very much. This has given us a lot of food for thought and makes me a bit concerned about how many discussions of issues and topics for 2021 we're going to come up with under our next agenda item, and then how we are going to prioritize them if necessary, given the bandwidth and time that we have to get our report out by January of 2022. So I'm just going to check one more time for blue hands and crying emojis, depending on who's putting them up, to see if there are other questions about Dr. Braithamo, and I am seeing none. The next item on the agenda is a discussion of issues and topics for 2021. And I hope I can do this accurately, but before opening it up for questions and suggestions of topics, I just want to throw out the ones that I think I've heard already, so we can begin to construct a list. One was, the first three were from Brenda. One was waiver of fees, just that entire issue that needs to be explored. The other was metadata regarding services such as mail. The third was, and this might be a larger topic than the one she raised, but the whole remote participation issue. Brenda raised a specific issue about how does one have what happens when you're trapped without a policy regarding remote meetings, particularly if there are new entities formed. And I think there were other issues that were raised about remote participation that need discussion. The fourth was and this was from Kate Ryan, to consider the large issue of how long do confidential documents need to be kept confidential? Is the default position of 75 years? Does that cover all of the concerns? And I'm doing these pretty quickly. And then the bevy of issues raised in the October 8th memo, which apparently mimic Eric's concerns that he's raised for 6 years regarding a different way to look at exceptions from top down or bottom up. So that, if my math is right, gets me to 5 issues. And I now want to open it up. I know my friend Chris Parr always has issues that he would like the committee to look at, but I'm not putting any pressure on you, Chris, but I do open it up to any member of the committee who wants to discuss or raise issues that they have concerns about, that they want considered to be looked at by the Right to Know Advisory Committee. So I'm going to start looking for blue hands. Oh, and there we go. What do you know? Chris Parr. Christopher.
Hi. And yes, I have issues.
Yeah.
I guess it's more of a question that I should have probably asked when Kate was speaking earlier. And it's this, judging by my years of observation now, especially through the remote access that we all now enjoy. It seems like a lot of policy decisions might be being made through text messaging. And I was curious as to, because of the magnitude of decisions that potentially could be made through just use of a phone, communications, especially during meetings while they're actually happening. I was wondering, has the state, where's the state as far as its ability to memorialize and store those types of messages? Where I have to imagine that that's quite a challenging prospect for your office, but just wanted to see what your thoughts were. I'm not saying that we should add that as a topic, incidentally. It is something that concerns me because I think that a lot of that happens, and it's very convenient for it to happen. And I think it also frustrates the ability for there to be transparency. So anyway, if you had I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, Kate.
I do. There's actually a group of us with the archives, Maine IT, the Attorney General's office, and then sometimes you, Chris, talking about emails and digital record retention and how the state can best do that. We've actually had a small group spin off to start talking about social media retention and how we can do that. We haven't jumped into text messages yet, but I think that's next, as well as the whole Teams chats. There's a lot of that too, and how can that be retained? Part of the problem right now is that the state does not have a digital preservation system. We have Maine IT, and they're saving things on servers and in the clouds. And as Eric likes to remind me, it's almost all in the cloud now. But we don't have a preservation system or a records management system to keep those things that are only supposed to be kept for a short amount of time and then delete them at the appropriate time, or to preserve long-term those things that are born digitally. Some state archives across the country are beginning to use programs that do that. It's new, but about half of the state archives in our nation are beginning to use services like that. And Maine's, we're looking at that. We're beginning to research some options. So these are all conversations that are starting, but we don't have any way to do it yet.
I appreciate that. I appreciate all the hard work that you've done toward this. Like I said, I don't intend to suggest that we take this on. It's too big, and I also think it's too premature. I think maybe I do think it's worth, and I will make it a point to repeat that this is an issue that goes right to the heart of transparency and the FOA. And I hope that when we eventually can do something to address it, we do. But thank you very much for all your work.
Thank you, Chris. Anything else on your plate?
I did suggest two things, and maybe I don't have them right in front of me. One was to just, there were two ideas. One, Kate had kind of sort of alluded to earlier, and I actually got the idea listening to a Judiciary Committee hearing where I didn't realize that there was this 75-year post-transfer to archives removal of confidentiality provision in the law already. And I thought, just as a matter of, maybe amending or clarifying or putting some sort of cross-reference in the definition of public records that talks about, public records do not include confidential records or records designated confidential by statute, that maybe it's worth putting a cross-reference, except to the extent they become public under this other provision of law, just as an idea. And to Eric's point, I do agree with him. I think that right now there are many patchworks of different statutes out there that cover the same sort of things. And as a matter of just making it easier for people to know, to be able to reference statutes, it would be good to try to work toward, if there's some sort of common sort of exception that is made, that maybe there's a more generalized exception put into the FOA itself. One of those, as a topic idea that I had, that I think I got this idea while I was watching Judiciary, was this idea of proprietary information. I know that with some FOA requests that I've dealt with before, that's come up as an issue. And it seemed like that was an issue that I heard at least once, I think before Judiciary, if not more recently. And so if there, I say this, maybe we should make a general exception for proprietary information. At the same time, though, I was also a proponent of having included in the list of considerations for exemptions that the Judiciary has to go through on that matrix, whether or not something might present a health or safety issue that people should be able to know about. And so I wouldn't want that public policy point undermined by the ability to just exempt something as proprietary information, when that information actually might be important for the public to be able to get if it might affect their health or safety. So anyway, those are the two. That's the very long-winded way of saying those are the two things I brought forward more formally.
Tom, I think you're muted.
I apologize for that. I was asking, are there others who want to weigh in? I did say on my count, we're up to 9 already, so don't feel the need necessarily, but I will certainly entertain them. And the first hand I saw was Eric Stout and then Justin Chanette.
Yeah, so if Chris is making a suggestion about a topic to talk about, policy decisions, for example, through text messaging and how you capture that or make that a record, I would agree with that topic to discuss, but would broaden it to other platforms that are, every year we have more and more different tools and platforms, both within the states, Microsoft Suite, they're rolling out another way to squirrel away information or communications, whether it's in Teams chat messages or whatever, and so the discussion might be broader as to if people are using these different platforms, either supported by the state or phone text messages that aren't captured by the state system, or other third-party things like this MailChimp thing that Brenda mentioned, whatever it might be. I believe the federal government has a broad policy. We could look into this about that. If, for example, you receive something through your personal email, then the policy is you have to forward it to your state email and make it a discoverable record. And to Kate's point, if it's archival value, enduring value, then it should be transported into a future archives preservation, records preservation system. But maybe that's a discussion for this group, or maybe it's for the Archives Advisory Board, or both, because they cross over domains between records retention and transparency of those records to comply with FOA. But I would agree with Chris's idea, but broaden it beyond just text messaging to other technology tools and platforms that are not as easy to be discoverable.
Thank you, Eric. And Justin, I saw your hand went down, but maybe that's because you knew I was going to call on you.
Perfect. Thank you, Representative. It looks like we already have a bucket of remote participation, but I would just add something that I referenced earlier, is this idea of this patchwork of some communities having a remote policy and remote capability for public participation, and other communities maybe have more of a lax policy or don't have a policy at all. And so whether or not there should be a discussion around a state mandate. I know we don't like the M word, but is it a question of equity of access for the public when there is not a remote policy in place? Does that raise some lingering questions regarding public participation and access to government? And then should there be an incentive for communities to have a remote policy, for communities that can't afford necessarily to have remote technology? Or maybe there's certain ones that have a remote policy but have such horrible equipment, folks can't even participate, which is happening with a lot of our county commission districts. And so I would just add a few other points to that bucket of remote participation.
Thank you. Senator Carney.
Thank you. I'm raising an issue that I haven't thought through very much, but at the request of some fellow legislators, they would like us to consider and talk through the issue of people who are incarcerated and their inability to participate remotely in legislative hearings and other public hearings that other folks can access using technology, from wherever they are, and the equity of allowing some kind of participation.
And thank you for raising that. That was on my list as well. We may be speaking to the same legislators. I know that in our committee this past session, we had a variety of bills that had a great deal of impact on residents of jails and prisons regarding things like parole, establishing an innocence project, compensation for being improperly detained. And there were many people who were just perhaps the most affected were unable to participate. And we sometimes look at freedom of access simply about the ability to get information from the government, but there's another side of transparency, and that's the open meeting portion of the law. And I think if we have a segment of the population that is unable to participate in those discussions and to actually provide testimony like everyone else is allowed to, that we have a problem. So I share that concern, and that's on my list as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and even though they could submit testimony in writing, we as legislators lack the opportunity to ask follow-up questions.
Right. And it's different hearing somebody deliver their own personal story orally than it is to simply read it. I agree. Are there other thoughts from other members? I'm not seeing any blue hands. I guess my concern now is how do we prioritize, or do we prioritize all of these various issues? Again, my count has me somewhere over double digits, all worthy, but we meet as a large committee 4 times, a minimum of 4 times, before we issue a report in January. So I'm going to just float an idea and see if people find this a potential way to move forward. I think that our last, in the 129th, we had 2 subcommittees, one dealing with the public exceptions subcommittee that has a lot of work to do, and has statutorily required work to do regarding the chapters that Colleen outlined. And also we heard about the language regarding consistency in those exceptions. So to me, that's a subcommittee that we have to have. Again, I'm willing to be persuaded otherwise, but you're probably not going to get me on that one. I think the second committee we had was the remote participation subcommittee regarding best practices. I chaired that committee, that subcommittee in the 129th. Clearly, we still have issues out there, some issues that we anticipated, but issues that we did not anticipate until the statute that's now in effect was in effect. So I would put that towards the top of the list. I'm wondering, as a possible approach to, after this meeting, unless people are free to weigh in, we still have time, to poll all members of the committee to, one, get a sense of what your priorities are with these topics, and as importantly, your level of interest in participating on that subcommittee or any subcommittee. So I hope I'm being clear in what I'm thinking. So I'd like some, reflection and reaction. And I see Judy Meyer, you have your hand up.
I do. I think Chris's concern about the digital records is real. And I think we really need to start that conversation. I mean, it took us a decade and a pandemic to pass remote participation. So if we don't start talking about the digital records and how they're managed and how they're made accessible, I just think hopefully it won't take another pandemic, but I really don't want it to take 10 years. And I think the concern is real, and it's probably going to get worse very, very quickly. So maybe that's a subcommittee to look at that conversation and all of its tentacles.
And Judy, I'm assuming you would build on Eric's observation as well, that it's all of the different platforms that are
absolutely
out there, right?
Absolutely, and those to come. Yes,
those that we don't know about yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Senator Carney.
I just want to say that I agree. I think that should be one of our subcommittees and a significant priority for us to focus on.
Thank you. Jim.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that one of the things that will be very important in that conversation is encryption and conversation mechanisms, communication mechanisms that are designed to keep messages secret, which are being used very widely in federal government now, and it's a big problem up there. And so we might as well talk about it, because it will be a big problem here if it isn't already.
Thank you. I'm hearing a lot of support for that being a subcommittee, and a very important one. Chris.
Well, I didn't intend for that to become a topic, so I totally understand why. I totally get it. I wondered, because I was not thinking to write them down. What are the pending suggestions? We got the two I mentioned, the remote participation, the digital, the ability for communities to have accessibility to participate remotely.
I think that would fold into the remote participation subcommittee.
Okay. Okay.
The others were, and if I'm missing any, and people have better notes than I or a better short-term memory, the issue of waiver of fees was raised. The issue of platforms such as MailChimp that might be used in campaigns, but then subsequently, and I hope I'm understanding this right, subsequently are used if and when someone is elected to conduct correspondence with members of the public, and whether or not that metadata should be available. The issue raised by Kate regarding how long is too long for retention of records as confidential. The issue raised by Senator Carney and myself regarding residents of jails and prisons and their ability to participate in government like the rest of the citizens of Maine. And then the broad issue of exceptions, and can we develop templates and maybe larger groups and categories so we don't have to have 300 plus statutes regarding exceptions, which might be able to be folded into the public exceptions, the public records exceptions subcommittee.
So, but yeah, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. And as you were mentioning those, it seemed like, in my mind, there's definitely has to be a exception subcommittee, but there are certain of those topics, like the general exception provision, that discussing that type of thing, and the discussion of the two topics I mentioned. I think those could be also sort of folded into the public records exception subcommittee because they're related enough. The remote participation, including by inmates, I think that could be folded into that committee pretty easily for its consideration. And as far as the fee waiver, I suppose it's not related enough to the other things that it seems like that might need its own subcommittee, which I suppose could also take on maybe any other topics that the other two don't. But so that's my thinking.
Thank you, Chris. Eric.
Yeah, in a past year, some of these topics we talked about maybe having a subcommittee, and it was decided that the full committee really needed to vet it. So not everything, I think, would have to be a subcommittee first, because then you're rehashing the same things with the full committee. But certainly some things would, but maybe like the fee waivers is a full committee discussion, right up front rather than a peel off as a subcommittee. Just throwing that out there.
A separate subcommittee. Okay.
Well, not a subcommittee, but just discuss
rather than a subcommittee.
Right. The whole committee discuss. Right. Rather than. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Others? Okay, I'm trying to, and I'm going to have to work with Peggy and Colleen after today's meeting to try to pull these thoughts together, and then maybe even certainly poll people about their interest in actually joining one of these subcommittees. And what I'm hearing is that we have broad categories of a public records exceptions subcommittee with expanded responsibility, a remote participation subcommittee that might include the ability of residents of jails and prisons to effectively participate in governmental hearings and meetings. A technology subcommittee dealing with text and all the other platforms, and we might even roll the MailChimp issue into that, Brenda, if that makes sense to you. And then fee waivers as a full committee topic, unless you think I came up with all of this. Thank you, Peggy, for sending me that in the chat box. Does having those as our large buckets seem reasonable? And could a next step be for Peggy and I and Colleen to set up just a simple poll to all members trying to get your particular interest in joining one or more of those subcommittees? Does that make sense moving forward? I think it'd be too hard to parse all that out this afternoon. So thank you for that, Peggy and Jim.
What are we going to do about this meeting policy and before we do any more meetings?
That we, Peggy and I are going to meet on that probably remotely, but that's okay because it's just the two of us to try to get, we have to take steps to adopt a policy. What that is going to look like, I don't know sitting here right now, but that's number one on the hit parade.
Is it, I don't recall, and I don't know what the rule is about this, but is it possible, acceptably possible to poll people individually by phone about a policy, or is it, that probably won't work because you've got to be there in person and everybody listening in? Is that the story?
As the Right to Know Advisory Committee, I don't want to be.
Yeah, okay.
I don't want to be engaging in the conduct that we find so troublesome.
I was just kidding.
Okay, all right. Thank you. He is always appreciated, even if not noticed by the chair. Chris, and then Senator Carney.
I just wondered if is the poll going to be also the level of interest, not only which committee, but the level of interest in each particular topic? Because I wouldn't want to waste everyone's time by having one of these subcommittees take up something that I'm only interested in. So I would encourage, some sort of, ranking of the, because even with subcommittees, the full committee is at some point also going to have to talk about everything. And it just seems like I don't want us trying to do too much and then not get quality work on any of them. So,
and I'm cognizant of not overloading people given the short period of time we have. So the poll would be of on both things, individual interest and level of importance. And it may be that a subcommittee that has a large bucket of items might internally decide these are the more important things that we think we can deal with at this time. Ann, Senator. Ann.
Just a quick question about format. So we're supposed to meet again on November 10th.
Yes.
And should we, since we need to adopt a remote meeting policy, do we have the AFA room reserved already? I knew you'd be like 3 steps ahead of us. Great.
We have the AFA room reserved for the next 3 meetings, which we had anticipated being hybrid, but we're going to have to do something, at least with a quorum physically present, to adopt a policy. At least that's what I'm hearing today.
Great. And so we'll have a mechanism to let you know who's going to be there in person to make sure we have a quorum.
Once I figure out what a quorum is and we have all of the members that still need to be appointed, we will do those things. Yes.
Thank you.
Judy.
So without a policy in place until we meet again on the 10th, the subcommittees would just need to be tight so we don't reach quorum and can meet remotely, yes?
Good question. I think the answer is yes. I was not necessarily anticipating them meeting before the 10th, but it probably makes sense to do so. I will factor that into the that I do with Peggy and Colleen and get that information out to the full committee.
Okay.
When subcommittees met in the past, were those were not noticed? Were they noticed and broadcast? They were? Okay. So another item to be resolved. Thank you for raising it. Any other thoughts, Peggy?
If not having a policy is holding you up, if we could actually come up with a date that would just be to meet to adopt a policy before November 10th, if the subcommittees want to get going before that, you could do that. I mean, it can be a regular meeting or it could be a special meeting just for that policy. If you want to consider that. I mean, I realize there's not a whole lot of time between now and November 10th, but there is some time if that makes sense.
What are our obligations regarding the extent and timing of public notice before that meeting can occur?
It's reasonable notice of the meeting.
Okay.
And whatever notice, we have a very large interested parties list. We can post it. We can put it in the legislative calendar.
Okay.
Certainly send it by email. So you'd want to make sure you actually had a quorum for that day.
Right.
And you'd want to have a draft policy out and available for public comment as well.
Okay. I think, and I'll look for I think a good idea to get a policy into place as quickly as possible, and we can throw out 2 or 3 dates for a meeting after this to see if we can secure a quorum in the AFA committee room. Make sense? Thumbs up. Yep. Okay. Now, we don't have that date yet, but I do want to go over the dates that we do have scheduled for a future meet, all of which we intend to be hybrid. And that is Wednesday, November 10th, the same time, 1 till 4, Wednesday, December 1st, and Wednesday, December 15th. Does that generally work for everyone? I didn't see a lot of conflicts in the emails that were going back and forth. Not seeing or hearing any concern. Eric?
Yeah, I just got thinking, if we needed a 5th meeting, there really wouldn't be time after December 15th practically to do so, getting into the holidays, would there? Just throwing that out there as a plan B if we needed a 5th meeting. Some years we have had 5 meetings.
And Peggy, can you remind me, I know that our report is not due to a date certain in January. When is the legislature going back into full session, and which means when do we lose the support of you folks?
Right. The legislature, I believe, convenes January 5th. So you would have staff available, at least not prohibited by statute from working with you up until that day.
And is it possible to get authority to have staff working with us beyond that date?
I don't know that we've ever actually asked for that, but I have a memory of a meeting in January. So I suppose that might be possible, but especially legislators will remember that the second regular session starts off at pretty much a run, so rather than a leisurely pace. So I'm not sure how much support we would have for working with this as opposed to our committees, and how much time the legislators would have.
Right. Okay. Well, looking at the list that I mean, the dates that we have now, we are going to have a 5th meeting, but simply to adopt the policy. And the amount of committee work that we're talking about, I think we have to plan on the 4 meetings that the 4 and the 1 additional meeting that we have almost scheduled. And if there is it appears we're not going to be able to finish by the 15th, that we'll have to figure out something to do in that difficult holiday time.
Okay.
So I will work with Peggy and Colleen to get these wheels in motion as quickly as possible, maybe even later today or tomorrow morning. I do have something at 4. Are there other comments, concerns, questions from any committee members before I entertain a motion to adjourn? See something in the chat. Oh, welcome, Linda Clancy. If you want to just take a second to introduce yourself to those committee members who might not know you.
Hi there, and thank you so much, and sorry for coming on late and carrying myself as an L all the way up from Portland, but I was in the car, so I was remote. I'm Linda Clancy, and I represent the press.
Thank you, and thank you for being on the committee again. Greatly appreciate your input. And with that, unless I see a blue hand in the next 30 seconds, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion made by Linda Cohen. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jim Campbell. All those in favor, just a show of physical hands. Does that look unanimous, Peggy?
It does to me.
Close enough?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all very much, and we will sort all of this out so that we have an effective, efficient, and productive series of meetings to conclude our work. Thank you all for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.